So now let's look at the history of the United States banking system. And so before we look at the time frame, I want to let you know the Federal Reserve bank system is not always existing. Actually, it did not start until later years. So that's what we're going to look at. Originally, how our banking system looked like. So our first bank is not the Federal Reserve Bank. So our first commercial bank is called the Bank of North American, and that is chartered by the state system. So it is. Do you know where it's located? Yes, it's actually in Philadelphia. So this is the first commercial Bank of the North America, and so later, and as the more and more banks start opening, so the people realize we need somebody there to help the regulating the whole banking system. Therefore, in 1791, so that is our first Federal Reserve like federal banks. It's called Bank of the United States. However, when the Bank of the United States was running, there is a debate between the states and the federal, because the people want freedom. They always don't want to have a centered organization to control the banking system. Therefore, in 1811, so this Bank of the United States, similar like the Federal Reserve now, actually is elapsed, which means closed. And however, as the we get into the war, and so people realize that we do need a central bank that can help to save the economy and implement the policies. Therefore, the second central bank operated. So the second central bank is called the Second Bank of the United States. So again, it's similar like the Federal Reserve, but still there are a lot of differences, because the main role for this bank is much different from the Federal Reserve we are having now. And so Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharting the Second Bank of the United States. Again, people don't want. Some people they just don't want to have this centered bank to control the banking system. Therefore, in 1832, so this second federal bank closed down as well. And not until 1860. And so the Congress passed the National Bank Act of 1863 that established the national banks and office of the controller of the currency. And eventually, in 1913, our first Federal Reserve banking system created. So that's why I said at the very beginning of the U.S. history, we don't have this Federal Reserve banking system. So the real Federal Reserve System didn't establish until 1913. So that is the Federal Reserve System we see nowadays. So later we're actually going to look at where they located. And so in 1933, so we have the Great Recession, and so the banking system realized the weakness of the whole banking system. So therefore, the Congress passed another act called the Banking Act of 1933, and so to create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the separating banking and security industry, mainly to try to make sure this banking system can still run very healthily. So this is the history of our commercial banking system. So maybe you never knows it before, but now after learning this video, you actually know how this history look like. And so during to summarize what we discussed about the whole history of the banking system, you have to know that the Federal Reserve and the State Banking System Authority running the state banks that are member of the Federal Reserve System. And so Federal Reserve also regulate bank holding companies. So some big company also holding larger share of the banks, those called the bank holding companies. And also the FDIC insures state banks that are not federal members, and the state banking authority will able to state banking authority is the one state banks without the FDIC insurance. And so The major players in this market, including the national banks. So all the national bank has to be the member of the Federal Reserve System. And so for the state banks, so they will become options. Some relatively larger state banks, they will opt out to become part of the Federal Reserve banking system. And but many of the state-owned the banks will be insured under the FDIC. So generally speaking, the banking systems here is pretty safe, solid, because the double security from the Fed and also the deposit insurance company. So this is the history of the U.S. banking system. In next video, we're going to look at the financial innovation. And so again, everything we're learning here is prepare us to understand what happened in chapter 12, the financial crisis.